There were two pillars in the 50s. Elvis changed the music, and Jimmy changed our lives.
Massively influenced by him when I was younger as well. I mean, he's a good template to follow for a young guy, especially if you're acting.
I think he really still is the gold standard for that rebel icon.
His perfection will always be preserved because he died so young.
James Dean is the ultimate image of cool. I mean, when he wore a red coat, he looked on fire. When he wore glasses, he made smart look sexy. When he died, he made disaster look glamorous.
People were just starting to discover who he was, and then he was gone.
On February 8, 2011, James Dean would have celebrated his 80th birthday. In the hearts and minds of film fans around the world, he remains frozen in time as the defining image of youthful rebellion.
He will always be 24. He will always be a rebel. He will not settle down and get married and have kids and move to the suburbs and trade in his fast motorcycle for a station wagon.
When James Dean died, in a tragic car accident at the age of 24, he had only completed 3 major motion pictures.
East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and then Giant. All of them are shot within the space of a year.
Up until that moment in time, grown-ups set the styles. Stand up! Suddenly, Jim was king.
People were just starting to discover who he was, and then he was gone.
Yet today, he is a Hollywood icon of the highest order, a major talent who died young and remains a timeless symbol of cool.
James Dean never really was able to be uncool. He never gave a bad performance. He never got old.
He embodied the spirit of teen angst and disaffected youth unlike anyone before him, and his work continues to be embraced by each new generation.
James Dean's legacy continues to resonate because he speaks to people who desire connection. That's not rebelling against no cause. That's wanting something very real.
No actor has ever left a more indelible impact on the world in such a short period. And as time goes on, the legend of James Dean continues to grow larger every day.
I think James Dean is still popular today because phenomenons like him come around so rarely. I also think he's a connection between our sort of neon, golden era Hollywood past and today, when celebrity really is king.
James Dean continues to have resonance today also is because he's captured at a moment where he's so young, he's so beautiful, he never will age. He never will grow old.
I think he really still is the gold standard for that rebel icon.
James Byron Dean was born in Marion, Indiana on February 8, 1931. His parents, 23-year-old Wynton and Mildred, age 20, had rushed into marriage and were still adjusting to the idea that they were a family. When Jimmy was still a toddler, they moved to Wynton's hometown of Fairmount. Mildred stayed home doting on the boy, while his father worked as a dental technician.
Wynton Dean was a very inarticulate kind of man who found it very difficult to express his emotions or show any enthusiasm. Jimmy spent an awful lot of time trying to curry his attention, affection, and etc. And although it was there, it was always hidden.
Unable to make much of a connection with his father, Jimmy grew closer with his mother. Mildred taught him to draw and to paint, and the two loved to entertain house guests and relatives.
His mother was a very loving person, and I think probably Jimmy got some of his theatrical wants from her. I think she probably influenced Jimmy quite a bit on going into the acting career.
In the summer of 1935, Jimmy's dad got an unexpected break. With the country mired in the Great Depression, Wynton accepted a promotion that moved them all to Santa Monica, California. Jimmy's mother enrolled the shy boy in kindergarten at Brentwood Elementary School. and signed him up in dancing and violin classes as well. The little boy excelled at his lessons, with constant encouragement from his mother.
They had this little magic theater that they would play with dolls and act things out. And also the wishing game, where he would put something under his pillow at night and she would make it come true. So she sort of inculcated him with a sense of, you know, magical achievement and differentness.
Then, in the fall of 1939, the 8-year-old's life was shattered when his mother was diagnosed with cancer.
Uncle went and wrote to my mother and said that Mildred was very sick, according to the doctors, that she wasn't going to survive.
Jimmy watched as his mother wasted away. His best friend in the world was abandoning him, and he couldn't understand why. On July 14, 1940, Mildred Dean died. To make matters worse, Jimmy's father sent him back to Indiana for his mother's funeral without him. When Winton insisted that Jimmy stay in the family's hometown of Fairmount with his aunt and Uncle Winslow, Jimmy burst into tears.
And Uncle Winton had spent all his financial resources. He had a lot of medical bills that he had to pay, and he knew that coming back here to Indiana to live with his sister would be the best thing for Jimmy. And I imagine at the time, possibly he might even thought it would be a temporary thing.
That rupture meant that he had not only lost his mother, but he had lost his father as well. As a result, he had this kind of lost boy aura about him.
Even at the early age of 9, you can get a sense of the disparity between you know, an upbeat place like Los Angeles and then moving out to the Midwest, which was a completely different scene for him.
At first, Jimmy found it hard to adapt to the rough and tumble nature of small-town life. Slowly, the introverted boy discovered that he was a natural athlete, and he began to make new friends.
We started competing against each other in sports, and that's when I first got to know him. Jim, he was a go-getter. Of course, he was a star basketball player, too.
You have to remember, in Indiana, basketball is religion, and if you want to be popular, you have to be popular in sports. I mean, it was a huge drive to be popular, to fit in, and that's what you did.
He eventually adjusted and actually succeeded in life in Indiana. He became pretty popular in his high school. It's funny that a lot of his roles are as a disaffected high school student, and apparently he was actually pretty popular in high school because he was an athlete.
But even as he tried to fit in, Jimmy knew he was different. A literate and well-traveled local pastor, Dr. James DeWeerd, recognized Jimmy's uniqueness. The two spent hours together listening to classical music and reading Shakespeare in the pastor's library. DeWeerd became a father figure to the boy, even taking him to the Indianapolis 500. Gradually, Jimmy was exposed to a world beyond Fairmount. Jimmy's artistic sensibilities were obvious to DeWeerd, who encouraged the teenager to perform.
He used to go to Back Creek Church down here with my mom, and he liked to get up in front of people and do things, and Mom would give him these little things to memorize for little Christmas programs and things like that.
Soon, church programs bored Jimmy, and he turned his energies toward bigger high school productions.
They were doing Frankenstein, so between he and I helped him build this mask. When he got ready to go on stage, I think he took his uncle's jacket or something and turned it backwards. And he had his big old boots that he wore, and he walked stiff-legged and so forth. He really looked the part. He did a fantastic job on it.
Daring to be different, Jimmy played a madman at the National Forensic League drama contest, screaming and tearing his clothes. His raw, emotional acting overwhelmed the judges and won him first prize. In May of 1949, he graduated from high school, convinced he was born to be an actor. After the war, Jimmy's dad, Winton, settled back in Los Angeles and remarried. Eager to get out of Fairmount, Jimmy decided that his dad was his ticket into college. He came to live with Winton, promising to study business. But when Jimmy switched from pre-law to drama at UCLA, his dad hit the ceiling, and Jimmy hit the road. He loved his father, but he couldn't give up acting. He moved out to keep the peace.
I think Dean went into acting rather than pre-law when he went back to California, partly as a rebuff to his father. It certainly was where his passion was, but his father and a pre-law degree would have represented the establishment. That certainly wasn't James Dean.
In the fall of his sophomore year, the 19-year-old snagged the role of Malcolm in the campus production of Macbeth. But Jimmy's self-taught style of acting didn't impress fellow drama students.
He was like straight off an Indiana farm. His diction was just terrible, and he was in Macbeth, and it was being spoken like, you know, a Hoosier farm boy. You might have thought that because he was so bad in Macbeth, he wouldn't ever get an agent. But in fact, a minor agent by the name of Isabel Dresmer took him on.
Shortly after the play's run, Jimmy landed his first paid job. Dancing around a piano in a Pepsi commercial.
Pepsi-Cola hits the spot.
Then, barely 20 years old, Jimmy quit UCLA when he scored a starring role as the Apostle John in the television program Hill No. 1.
He is risen, John. This is the veil that was wrapped around his sacred head. Yet I do not understand.
He will enlighten us, Peter. Come, we must spread these good tidings quickly.
But the show was a one-shot deal, and with no work on the horizon, the cocky actor became moody and unpredictable.
They were very strange, inward-looking moods, almost impossible to penetrate, and he became very irritable if you tried to penetrate. I mean, more than irritable, annoyed, irascible.
In desperation, Jimmy used whatever contacts he could to get ahead. He started parking cars at CBS, just in hopes of meeting a bigwig.
I think that a pivotal moment for him was when he was working as a parking lot attendant. You know, you have to be a charming person. He met a radio producer at the time who became instrumental, I think, in his entire career. His subsequent, all of his breaks came from this chance meeting in the parking lot with one person.
Jimmy was terribly opportunistic. He saw a possibility for making acquaintances and getting to know people and opening a door, getting inside. He knew how to do all of that and did it, and did it well.
I think that James Dean was well aware that he was an exceptionally beautiful man early on in his life. And it's clear from any biographer that you read that he knew how to use his looks to his advantage, and that he was perhaps a manipulative person and used his attractiveness to further his career.
Well, one can only imagine what that level of charm and beauty can do to somebody and the attention that it gets. And it's clear that when he wanted to use it, he could charm men and women to get ahead, and he clearly did.
One of those acquaintances was a well-connected CBS radio director, Rogers Brackett. Dean's smooth good looks drew Brackett like a magnet, and Jimmy, the Indiana farm boy, loved hanging out with the director's high-flying friends. He and Brackett began dining in the best restaurants, attending private screenings, and mingling with the film industry's elite.
Jimmy described Rogers Brackett as a vampire, and I think, you can read whatever you want into that, but it's sort of questionable who was exploiting who. I think Jimmy was very ambitious and used whatever means he needed to get where he wanted to.
He got him roles, he introduced him to influential people in the industry. A very ambitious James Dean also was using that relationship to further his career.
Using his newfound connections, Jimmy got a guest spot on the TV series The Trouble with Father.
You know, when I want to take a girl to dance, I'll ask her, a month ahead of time, so if she doesn't want to go, I can ask a couple dozen more.
Well, that's because you don't understand women, son. You got to keep them guessing right up to the last minute.
No kidding?
Sure. Women are peculiar people. Once they feel they can depend on you, then they're not interested anymore. So you got to be completely undependable.
Yeah, I guess so.
Jimmy also landed a few speaking parts in feature films, but he was frustrated doing fluff movies. he wanted to be a serious actor.
His acting coach at UCLA was James Whitmore, and he said to him, if you are serious about acting, you've got to go to New York. There's no way around it. And you've got to get into the theater.
In September of 1951, James Dean decided to gamble his promising career on a trip to New York. He was willing to risk everything to see his name in lights. By the early 1950s, mainstream America was reveling in economic good times, investing in modern kitchens and the newest Chevrolet. But when a down-and-out Jimmy Dean arrived in New York City, an underground counterculture was emerging. For the Midwestern farm boy longing for sophistication, Manhattan was the place to be.
During his years in New York, James Dean really started to be part of the Bohemian underground, the beatnik culture that was really developing in Greenwich Village at that time.
And this is the early 50s, and television was just exploding. It was a very fertile ground for exploring new types, the new psychological type that had arisen, which was the juvenile delinquent.
Jimmy's fresh face appealed to television producers looking to fill teenage roles. In Something for an Empty Briefcase, he was cast as a street thug striving for a better life.
I want to do something. I want to be somebody so I can hold my head up. I don't want to have to be ducking it every time a cop comes by. Mickey, you see that guy with the briefcase?
Yeah? What about him?
That's what I want to do. I want to carry a briefcase.
They were doing live shows like Studio One in those days, and Suspense and Danger, and they were all done live. And the theater, you know, was burgeoning. It was a big amusement park as far as I was concerned.
Jimmy took to roaming the streets till dawn, lurking in the jazz clubs and coffee bars with the beatniks, listening to poetry and the far-out sounds of bebop. His bohemian bent didn't land him any work, but his little boy charm cast a spell on women.
We met at the rehearsal club. I was reading a magazine, he was reading a magazine, and we were kind of opposite each other, and he started to mumble and I started to mumble, and then he read a line from his magazine and I read a line from mine, and we started doing this sort of game.
The two became inseparable, and within weeks had decided to move in together.
We didn't know what to do. We had no money. We couldn't tell anybody. It was the 50s. You just didn't do it, especially as young as we were. And it was just sort of an unheard of thing.
Jimmy's charisma attracted both men and women, and he was learning how to use this power to his advantage. When he heard that Rogers Brackett had moved to town, Jimmy tore himself away from Liz and hooked up again with the CBS director.
He was trying to keep it friendly with Rogers Brackett, but he didn't feel like he should have to give himself to anybody for the price of being an actor. But he did, because he was young and because he didn't know what the hell he was doing really, and because he wanted to be important.
Jimmy was bisexual. He said, do I look like someone who would want to go through life with one hand tied behind my back? But he never chose a man in the time that I knew him. He chose women.
Dean did not respect the bounds of middle-class propriety. The world was here to experiment with. The world was here to live in.
Jimmy used Brackett to get small parts on several TV dramas. On Studio One, he played a Civil War soldier pardoned by Abraham Lincoln.
The general tells me you've been court-martialed.
Yes, sir.
Sleep on guard.
Yes, sir.
That's a very serious offense.
I know, sir.
What was it?
Couldn't keep awake, sir.
But Jimmy was frustrated that he still wasn't getting any really juicy roles.
In New York, you literally make rounds. It was catch as catch can, but it was always with the idea of getting that good one, you know, and particularly a Broadway play or lead on television.
When he did start getting television, it was just dinner is served. You know, it was just one little line and then out, and it was frustrating the hell out of him. He just said, I'm better than this.
As fall approached, Jimmy knew what he had to do. The yearly tryouts for the Actors Studio were coming up.
To be accepted in the Actors Studio was a huge thing. It meant you were not only an actor, you were an artist, you were one of the elite.
James Dean was not just some, lucky, handsome kid who, he was someone who worked seriously at his chops. He was someone who was respected and wanted to grow.
In November of 1952, 21-year-old James Dean beat out 150 other hopefuls, becoming the youngest actor to ever earn a spot in the prestigious workshop.
Well, getting inside the Actors Studio was a huge boon at that time for anybody. And this was obviously the time of Elia Kazan and Marlon Brando and all those great actors. And for Dean to get in there as one of the youngest entries ever was a feather in his cap that he was not going to pass up.
That was probably the proudest moment of his life thus far. He wrote home and said that this was a great achievement, that he was one of the youngest people ever to be admitted, which was true. The other actors that he mentioned in this letter to his dad included people like Marlon Brando, and you could get a sense of James Dean's idols just from this one piece of correspondence.
But before Jimmy could celebrate, a seemingly tailor-made part suddenly landed in his lap. A friend of Brackett's, Broadway producer Lemuel Ayers, fell in love with Jimmy's good looks and offered him a major role in a new play, See the Jaguar.
He played this sort of retarded boy who had been locked away from people by his mother and was almost like an animal.
Dean felt a personal connection to the part of a teenager trapped in a cage. See the Jaguar opened on Broadway at the Court Theater on December 3rd, 1952. The play wasn't a hit with the critics, but it was a turning point for Jimmy's career.
The play was panned, it closed in 5 days, and James Dean was singled out as the shining moment in the play.
With a big head and high hopes, Jimmy quit the Actors Studio. He had learned what he wanted, the technique of total immersion in his characters. Now, he had to develop his own style, and the fledgling television industry still seemed the best place to start.
Okay. Everything I do annoys you. I guess you'll be glad to get back to that big city pretty soon.
Paul, you know I'll miss you.
Well, I hope so, honey.
Oh, Joey. Hey, how's your little boy?
Well, he's got asthma, hasn't he? How'd you expect him to be? You had asthma, how you think you'd be?
No, I was only asking you a civil question.
My wife and me, we were up with him about all night. He just laying there trying to get his breath and, gasping for air. Can't do nothing. Does that answer your question?
The stuff he did on television were young guys trying to buck a system. They're guys who come out and literally break through and change things. And Jimmy was the embodiment of that.
But while the jobs were rolling in, Jimmy was getting a bad rap around town. He liked to mumble his way through rehearsals, saving his energy to keep his final performance fresh and spontaneous. His maverick approach infuriated established stars and burned up directors.
Everything was live, so producers and directors put on their hearts in their mouths because he would do many, unscripted things. But, the audiences loved them.
Dean was now earning $200 to $300 a show, but he spent it just as fast as he made it. He bounced from apartment to apartment, toting his most cherished possessions, jazz records, bongo drums, and an old bullfighter's cape.
He had no money. He didn't seem to worry about where he was going to sleep or how he was going to live. He was constantly sponging from people all the time.
In December of 1953, Dean was cast in a racy new play about a marriage torn apart by a homosexual affair, The Immoralist. Once again, Jimmy caused trouble for the director and the cast. He arrived late to rehearsals, changed his delivery in every single scene, and loved to mock the show's leading man, Louis Jourdan.
And he did not like working with Louis Jourdan at all. He didn't have a happy time doing The Immoralist.
The Immoralist opened on Broadway in February of 1954. Critics singled out Dean, granting him a Daniel Bloom Award for the most promising Broadway personality of 1954. But The Immoralist had led to an even bigger reward. Director Elia Kazan came to see Dean in the play and loved him. He spotted just the attitude he needed for a character in his next film.
He received great acclaim on Broadway, and soon enough people started calling, not just from Hollywood, but directors in New York who had seen him who said, you know, here's someone young who is fresh. And one of the first calls he received was from Elia Kazan.
In March of 1954, a nervous James Dean climbed on a plane carrying everything he owned in 2 paper bags and headed for Hollywood. In April of 1954, James Dean signed a $10,000 contract with Warner Brothers to star in Elia Kazan's new film, East of Eden. Dean was set to play teenager Cal Trask, but Kazan had yet to cast the older brother. Paul Newman was brought in for a screen test with Jimmy, and the two seemed to hit it off.
It's a point of whether I go for the girls, though, you know.
Paul, you think the girls go for Jim?
Oh,
Look
great.
at him. Size him up. Kiss me. Huh?
Can't hear.
But the rapport between the actors was not what Kazan was looking for. While the casting dragged on, Jimmy began spinning his wheels around town. With his first paycheck, he bought a motorcycle. But when he raced it across the Warner Brothers lot, Kazan gave him hell.
Kazan had to stop him. The studio had to stop him from using his motorcycle. He was racing and taking chances. Always took chances.
Jimmy defied the studio brass, buying a sports car and speeding along Hollywood's twisty Mulholland Drive. Unable to sleep as filming drew near, he often drove the streets of LA until he saw the sunrise.
He was kind of known as a bit of a wild child, and during East of Eden, the director, Elia Kazan, was so concerned about his sort of night recreational activities that he actually had him moved onto a bungalow on the studio lot so that he could keep an eye on him.
Hanging out all night on the Sunset Strip, Jimmy met local TV personality Mila Nurmi, better known as late-night TV horror host Vampira.
He wanted to meet me because I was Vampira. I wanted to meet him because he was from another planet like I was, you know. He was a stranger on this planet. And he too, he thought he was from some other planet. So I was like his West Coast mother.
In May of 1954, Kazan cast Richard Davalos as Aaron, and production began on East of Eden. Jimmy immersed himself in the role of the son, who is constantly trying to earn the love of his father, played by Raymond Massey.
That's for you. It's all the money you lost in the lettuce business.
Cal, you will have to give it back.
No, I made it for you, Dad. I want you to have it.
I don't want the money, Cal. I couldn't take it.
I'll keep it for you. I'll wrap it up and we'll just keep it in here. And then
I'll never take it. Son, I'd be happy if you'd give me something like, well, like your brother's given me. Something honest and human and good. Don't be angry, son.
Dean's portrayal of Cal Trask is really one of biblical proportions, and Kazan wanted him to improvise as much as possible. So Dean met that challenge, and there's famously the scene where he's going to give his father the money and Raymond Massey is rejecting it. And rather than pull away from Massey, Dean improvises and goes towards him, giving him this giant sloppy hug.
Cal!
Talk to me, Father.
He had all these issues with the father, all of this stuff. So really, I think in the end, Kazan saw it almost as kind of a documentary way, documenting his kind of psychological state.
While filming on the Warner Brothers lot, Jimmy was introduced to an actress known as Pierre Angeli. The 24-year-old was drawn to the Italian star's sophistication and elegance.
They fell in love immediately. She was beautiful and angelic and European and a star. And her mother couldn't stand him. So, you know, you have star-crossed lovers, and what could be more irresistible to James? Romeo and Juliet in Hollywood.
She was a much bigger star than he was at that time. East of Eden hadn't been released, so really nobody knew who he was in Hollywood. But he charmed her using his James Dean charm and beautiful face, and she was smitten.
Deeply in love, Jimmy had finally found a place where he truly fit in. Within weeks, Hollywood's gossip columns were spreading news of their affair. That September, he begged Pierre to elope, but the actress refused, fearing her mother's reprisals. Jimmy's world came crumbling down when Pierre told him she could never see him again. Her family preferred a Catholic suitor, pop singer Vic Damone.
Her parents pushed her into the marriage with Vic Damone, and Jimmy stood across the street and cried when she got married. And both of their lives were sort of ruined because they weren't allowed to marry.
3 months later, Jimmy slouched unnoticed in the front row at a sneak preview of East of Eden.
Well, his performance in East of Eden was a revelation. And a star is someone who gives the audience a little bit of something familiar with a lot of something special. And that's what Dean had.
Critics in the audience loved the film. But the biggest reaction came from the hundreds of teenagers packed in the balcony.
Classic role, we see it created every year in Hollywood still, and it still creates teen idols. Something about that misunderstood, yet beautiful, yet lonely, really appeals, I think, to teen girls.
People were coming out saying, this guy's unbelievable, who is he? I mean, you know, some people were in tears. I mean, it was a major thing for Jimmy to see.
You watch a movie like East of Eden and you can feel, even decades later, that this is someone communing with the lens, communing with us in the audience. He creates a conversation, and that conversation is with young people.
East of Eden opened across the country in April of 1955, and within days it had rocketed to America's #1 spot at the box office. Suddenly the press was hungry for anything about America's new teenage idol.
It completely changed his life. He couldn't go anywhere. Women, photographers, everybody swarmed after Jimmy Dean. He became an icon almost immediately, and he loved it. He really did. He pretended he didn't, but he did.
Finally, Jimmy was where he wanted to be, on top. But fame didn't sit right with the brash new star.
I think that he was uncomfortable with the adoration and being a teen idol.
People started kissing his ass, and he began, you know, really acting really badly, getting drunk, causing scenes.
He was indulging in an awful lot of stuff that was self-destructive. He got the name, the little bastard, because he was behaving like one around town.
And it was that kind of desperation which led to him picking fights with people, recklessly driving, cracking cars up.
Once again, Jimmy alienated the people closest to him, pushing them away when he needed them most.
You know, he also liked disturbing people, upsetting people. You know, it sort of involved them in his own drama, his own ongoing psychological epic.
While Jimmy angered the Hollywood establishment, young people everywhere were falling in love with him. The Warner Brothers mailroom was deluged in fan mail. Tens of thousands of letters, all addressed to James Dean. Millions of teens were identifying with the anguish their new Hollywood star brought to the screen. Suddenly, the old macho heroes were out, and a young new anti-hero was in. Jimmy Dean had given America's misunderstood teenagers permission to cut loose. In the spring of 1955, thousands of girls were chasing Elvis Presley along the Louisiana hayride, and a fan called the Hula Hoop was sweeping the nation. The teen era had begun. And young director Nicholas Ray wanted to jump on board with his new movie, Rebel Without a Cause.
So Rebel Without a Cause is definitely the movie that made James Dean an icon, whereas East of Eden got him the recognition as a legitimate actor. He created the, again, archetypal American disaffected teen and looked beautiful doing it.
Rebel Without a Cause is a very special moment in American cinema. It's very much of its own moment because it's about teen delinquency.
Dean starred with Natalie Wood, Sal Mineo, and Corey Allen in the story of a lonely young man struggling to fit in at a new high school.
There were kids running around wondering what to do with their adolescent energy. We were just looking for something to do. Kids began walking around in stomp boots and red jackets. Everybody looking for the that Jimmy seemed to have turned them on to.
Rebel Without a Cause is really a movie about adolescents, made by adolescents, including Nick Ray, for adolescents. And the adolescent, the teenager, was the classic American outsider, or the person that saw themselves, as opposed to adult bourgeois society.
It's not a stretch to say that teenage life was never seen before in film like this. Until James Dean screamed at his dad, "You're tearing me apart! You're tearing me apart!" We didn't have that kind of teenage rage in movies.
The director, Nicholas Ray, decided to cut Jimmy loose to improvise freely while he rolled the camera, catching every inflection.
Mom, a kid was killed tonight. I don't see how I can get out of that by pretending that it didn't happen.
Well, you know that you did the wrong thing.
Just tell a little white lie.
You'll learn when you're older, Jim. Stand up!
Rebel Without a Cause shouted out that the old studio system and its moth-eaten stars had better make way for an angry teen revolution.
Rebel Without a Cause would be actually a metaphor for Jimmy and Nick's feelings about the control of the studio system. But what they were looking for was truth in their expression. It's not driven by an interest in achieving a big, bank full of money.
And he also saw, for the first time, that he now was going to be part of this movie-making machine. He was, in other words, going to be part of this film factory of Hollywood.
24-year-old Jimmy was trying to define himself as an artist, but the trappings of fame began to suffocate him.
James Dean appeared to relate to fame in a very antithetical way. I think the bigness of fame made him want to run away from it, run away fast. I think his love of speed, his love of racing reflects that.
In the spring of 1955, his MG for a much faster Porsche, and began taking friends on hair-raising rides.
First night he got the Speedster. We went up Laurel Canyon, and he just had the pedal to the metal. And he would go around blind curves, And by the time we got on Mulholland Drive, he hit some dirt, and the car started sliding. And by the time that car stopped sliding, I could reach over the side of my passenger side and touch the edge of the mountain. And he was extremely cool about it all. And he said, next time through, I'll get it right to the edge.
Jimmy secretly went racing, knowing the studio would be furious if they ever found out. They didn't want anything to happen to their rising star.
He won Santa Barbara, he got a third down at Palm Springs. He was very devoted to whatever he got involved with, whether it was playing the bongos or the guitar, and especially in his driving career and what he could do to actually win.
In May of 1955, Jimmy took on the most challenging role of his career. Warner Brothers' youngest superstar would play Jet Rink in director George Stevens' production, Giant. Jimmy played a poor cowboy who strikes it rich, but still holds a grudge against the established Benedict family, headed by Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor.
My welcome in, babe.
Fine.
Why, that's wonderful, Jet.
I'm rich, baby. Me, I'm gonna have more money than you ever thought you could have.
Jet, we're real glad you struck him. Now you go on along home.
Oh, my, you sure do look pretty, Miss Leslie. You always did look pretty.
Trouble started brewing immediately on the set of Giant.
Well, Dean and director George Stevens famously clashed on Giant. George Stevens was an old-time director. I don't think he was going to go for any of James Dean's new Hollywood shenanigans.
George Stevens, he had his way that he wanted done, and he didn't want actors or actresses coming up with their own ideas, and Jimmy didn't like that.
Relations with the director were strained, but when Jimmy accidentally missed a day of work, Stevens hit the roof.
And he made a big speech to the whole company. He said, Mercedes McCambridge broke her leg and she's here on crutches. But this one, Jimmy. For the last 30 days, nobody would talk to him. He'd arrive at work and nobody would say hello or good morning. They made him up in silence. They dressed him in silence. They combed his hair in silence. Everybody hated him. They were told to show their disgust, and they did.
After the production returned to Hollywood in the summer of 1955, Jimmy was happy to get back to his racing. Ironically, the California Highway Patrol asked the hot-rodding actor to speak to teens about safe driving in a public service announcement with Gig Young.
How fast will your car go?
Oh, an honest miles an hour. Clocked, it run about 106, 7.
You've won a few races, haven't you?
Oh, 1 or 2.
Where?
Well, I showed pretty good at Palm Springs. I ran a Bakersfield. People say racing is dangerous, but I'll take my chances on the track any day than on a highway. Well, Gig, I think I'd better take off.
Oh, wait a minute, Jimmy. One more question. Do you have any special advice for the young people who drive?
Take it easy driving. The life you might save might be mine.
The day after he filmed the announcement, Jimmy traded in his Porsche Speedster for a brand new model, the 550 Spider. Car customizer George Barris helped him personalize the new car.
He brought the car to my plant in North Hollywood, and we wanted to put the numbers on. But I said, I got to put something on here that's traditionally you. And we start putting on Little Bastard. And he got a big kick out of it. He got the big smile because he really felt that made him exceptionally individual the way he wanted to be.
Jimmy busily prepared for an October 1st race in Monterey, California. But underneath, he was very lonely. He was still hurting from his breakup with Pierre Angeli and felt alienated from his fellow actors. His friends began to worry.
He had such a strong death wish, and now he's going to a car race and with a new car. People just put two and two together. They figured he's flirting too hard with death. Nobody could stop him. Everybody pleaded with him. Nobody could stop him.
On Friday morning, September 30th, Jimmy met Barris and Rolf Waithrich, his Porsche mechanic.
We loaded up with gas, and then he up and says, I want to drive it up. Oh, come on, Jimmy, that's 350 miles. You don't want to go up there with that much mileage on the car. And he said, no, I want to drive it up. Well, okay. So we unhooked the car, roll it out, and Roth, the mechanic, says, I'll go with you.
At 3:30 p.m., outside of Bakersfield, a highway patrolman cited Jimmy for speeding. Near the sleepy town of Paso Robles, California, Dean noticed a car approaching the only intersection in the valley.
As the sun is coming down, this little silver car is driving 60, 70 miles an hour. And the Ford was coming across and starts to make a left turn. It's quite obvious he didn't see Jimmy because that car blended with the asphalt.
A young college student, Donald Gene Turnipseed, was heading home from his classes in a Ford sedan. He never saw the tiny Porsche's last-ditch maneuver.
Turnipseed just kept going. And then he hits him right into the left front fender, carries on through the car. The car being lightweight, no roll bars, no anything, just absolutely brings the front end of the car right up into Jimmy.
The racing car crumpled on impact, throwing Waithrich across the road. Jimmy was crushed behind the wheel. 24-year-old James Dean was dead.
Couldn't have been written better. Here was the young man who opens his chest and reveals himself to the world, and Jimmy's gone.
On October 1st, 1955, news of James Dean's death rippled across the country, creating shockwaves of grief and disbelief.
James Dean's death shocked the world. It was tragic, and it was more than that in a strange way too. It was almost as if a younger generation's voice was suddenly extinguished.
I didn't want to believe it. Finally, we found somebody that we could admire and relate to, and just after 3 movies, he was gone. And I know I thought everything in this old cockeyed world was all used up.
I remember racing to the ocean, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I just wanted to run away or run into something that was comforting.
I felt like like some glass sculpture that just kind of fractured and just fell apart. Just in pieces,
On October 8, 1955, 4 months shy of his 25th birthday, James Dean's body was laid to rest near his mother in Fairmount, Indiana. The turnout for Jimmy's funeral was bigger than the entire population of his hometown.
There was around 3,000 people that attended the funeral. A lot of people had to stay in the church, and they put speakers outside the church.
Obviously, it was the first sort of shocking celebrity death in the media age that television could be involved.
Jimmy's possessions were immediately ransacked, as fans searched for anything to remember him by.
Jimmy's tombstone was stolen 3 times. People would take chisels or a screwdriver and get in where Jimmy's name was carved into the granite and chip out the granite for a souvenir.
Hysterical, grief-filled letters poured into Warner Brothers by the thousands. In response, the studio produced a documentary, The James Dean Story, as if he were still alive.
They started a very kind of subtle campaign of exploiting the occult, life after death, and this, of course, immediately caught on. The fan magazines picked it up like wildfire, and of course, teenagers loved this. The idea that he might not be dead.
East of Eden and Giant each earned James Dean an Academy Award nomination for Best Lead Actor.
Dean's back-to-back posthumous nominations for East of Eden and for Giant is the first time in history that an actor was nominated for a posthumous acting award.
And to Warner Brothers' amazement, the demand for his 3 films refused to diminish as the decade wore on. The cult of James Dean spread around the world, from Tokyo to Cape Town. His fans resurrected his image in every way they could.
Can't go anywhere in the world without seeing a T-shirt shop or poster or this and that, whether it be Budapest or London or wherever, without seeing Jimmy there. He's frozen in a way that creates mythology.
And on a human level, that's tragic. On a career level, that's made him an icon because he's never had a chance to really fail.
Decades after his death, the fascination with James Dean continued to grow unabated. In 2001, James Franco, an unabashed admirer of Dean, embodied the spirit of the legendary actor in the TNT made-for-TV biopic, James Dean. Franco's portrayal of the Hollywood legend won him a Golden Globe.
I think the minute that you saw him, it was uncanny how much he channeled James Dean.
As a tribute to Dean, in August of 2002, the infamous site near where Dean crashed his Porsche would now be known as James Dean Memorial Junction. In 2011, the man who embodied teenage alienation on the big screen would have turned 80 years old. Though he was now gone for over 55 years, his presence was still very much felt throughout the world. James Franco paid tribute to the actor working on an art exhibit titled Rebel, and stepped behind the camera to shoot a Dean-inspired photo spread for Elle magazine. Dean's timeless look and spirit has influenced major companies such as Kenneth Cole, Michael Bastian, and Triumph Motorcycles.
James Dean continues to be used by ad agencies because he's shorthand. He's a brand name. For guys, it's look like this or be like this. And for ladies, it's, hey look, we got James Dean. Even that name, that 2-syllable name, James Dean, seems perfectly market tested.
Today, James Dean is one of the highest paid deceased stars, as his likeness generates more than $5 million per year. Even current Hollywood A-listers are inspired by Dean's legacy.
I think it speaks to James Dean's status as a Hollywood icon that even big stars in Hollywood today are fans of his.
Well, the James Dean thing's obviously like, you can't really get a bigger compliment. I am massively influenced by him when I was younger as well. I mean, he's a good template to follow for a young guy, especially if you're acting.
It remains clear that though James Dean was gone, he was far from forgotten. His legend helped spark a revolution in American teenagers.
Jimmy opened the door for youth. I mean, look what happened after that. You know, they weren't trying to create a movement, they were just feeling change and were, you know, being drawn into the change.
James Dean was the rebel without a cause. He was the first person to express this kind of teen heroic ideal and make everybody want to be in that club.
Over 55 years after Jimmy's death, thousands of fans still gather each September in Fairmount, Indiana, to remember the dead star.
We get people that come from all over the world, Japanese people almost every day, people from Europe, Bosnia, Turkey, you know, Malaysia, you name it.
The world will never know what Jimmy might have achieved if he'd lived a longer life. But even in his short time, he tipped the Earth's cultural axis, and every teenager felt the shift.
I think if we're going to idolize somebody, it might as well be him. We saw the charm. He didn't get to show us much more, but this flaming promise.
He's been absorbed by the culture. He's now sort of an American icon in the sense of Charlie Chaplin or Humphrey Bogart. In fact, we have become James Dean.
There were two pillars in the 50s. Elvis changed the music, and Jimmy changed our lives.
James Dean is the ultimate image of cool. I mean, when he wore a red coat, he looked on fire. When he wore glasses, he made smart look sexy. When he died, he made disaster look glamorous.
He will never disappear, which is, you know, I think would make him very happy in an odd way. I mean, he did sure make a mark.
He's always fixed in time. He will always be James Dean, 24, young, rebel, beautiful.
As long as there are kids who are disenchanted by their parents and their lives, as long as there are moments where you just want to scream and scream until you're heard, there's always going to be room for James Dean.